May the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Two Sundays ago, we used a special prayer to honor the National Aboriginal Day of Prayer. So I thought I would use my time today to give you an update on our church's journey with our First Nations brothers and sisters, and a few thoughts on my experiences there. I want to take you back to the darkness of one night several years ago, while I watched as the shadows gradually gave way to the golden shafts of morning light, and there, illuminated before me, were the faces of Algonquins, Ojibways, Crees, Mohawks, Dakotas, and more. We sat circled around the sacred fire, a fire that would burn through 6 days and nights with its fragrance of burning pine and dancing sparks. Through the still air came the rhythm of a drum beat, and then the voice of an elder called on God, our Creator Spirit. Tobacco was offered in thanksgiving for the earth and water, the birds and the animals, and God's children gathered together. I sat in contented silence. I was attending a sacred circle with Anglicans of the First Nations in Pinawa, Manitoba. My journey with the First Nations people really began in 1978 when I was Archdeacon of Brant. And part of my area included the Six Nations Reserve. I remember vividly the night I was being installed at one of the reserve churches, and the men in the choir asked if I minded if they sang a couple of the hymns in Mohawk. I said, I thought that'd be great. And I was stunned when they said, they asked because they were usually discouraged from singing in their own language. It might be heretical. As I listened to the wonderful voices, I could only weep inside as I thought, what has the church done to these people, these fellow Christians? And by the way, if you ever have the opportunity of visiting Brantford and can go to the institute there, which was the former residential school, and visit the Mohawk Chapel, the Royal Chapel, please do. It's well worth a visit. Well, since 2004, I have been our primate's special envoy to the churches in relationship with Indigenous people. And this has been, I have to tell you, a steep learning curve for me. I've had the privilege of working with an ecumenical working group which has included Roman Catholics, Uniteds, Presbyterians, and Anglicans. And this has taken me through the negotiations with the government and the other churches as we struggled with the shame and the pain of the residential schools and eventually a financial settlement. Over the last few years, I've been involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its 7 gatherings which have taken place across the country, from Inuvik in the Arctic to Vancouver and Halifax and places in between. Just a brief note about history. After Confederation and the Indian Act of 1876, the new Canadian government assumed that it had a moral responsibility to educate and assimilate Indigenous children into the life and ways of the dominant white culture. This was to be done primarily through the residential schools. It was our government's decision, and even though we were not around then, we have some accountability for that misguided decision. The federal government, you see, did not want the bother of staffing the schools, and so the churches stepped in to help and hired people to care for the youngsters in these large residential institutions. Of the 130 schools in Canada, 35 were staffed through the Anglican Church. Most were not ordained people, and several were not even church people. But tragically, our Parliament sanctioned the removal of Native children from their, quote, evil surroundings of family and community for re-socialization. In the words of a century ago, and I quote, "The savage child would surely be remade into a civilized Western adult," end of quote. Well, it's hard to believe that these schools went on from the late 19th century right up until 1996. And by the time the last school was closed, over 190,000 Aboriginal, Inuit, and Métis children had attended. English only was to be spoken. Tribal customs and languages were to be forgotten, and often siblings were not allowed to speak to each other. I have to tell you that some schools were well run, with sensitivity by staff who loved the children and who cared for their culture and for their Indigenous roots and their traditions. But others were fraught with cases of unspeakable physical and sexual abuse. I've sat in circles and I have heard heartbreaking stories of pain and loneliness, of parents trying to hang on to their children as the Indian agents took them away, of children who reacted by running away and often never returning to their family home, of some who were died and were buried in cemeteries at the schools, while others still lie in unmarked graves. And I have wept many times. You may wonder why this happened. Why did we do this? And here is something that we need to understand. It's called the doctrine of discovery, and it undergirds the whole concept of the residential schools and racism in Western countries. I doubt that any of us in the dominant culture have any idea how integrated it is into our way of thinking in North America. And I'm slowly beginning to understand. This doctrine goes all the way back to the 15th century, when a papal decree gave Christian explorers the right to claim lands they discovered for their Christian monarchs. Any land that was not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited. If the pagan inhabitants could not be converted, or could be converted, they might be spared. If not, they would be enslaved or killed. And therefore, title to the newly discovered lands went to the government or ruler of the explorers who discovered any new territory. This attitude that European civilization is superior to the civilizations of indigenous peoples meant that native peoples were treated as children of a colonized country rather than sovereign nations. One quote states that Europeans were required to look after the protection and welfare of this unfortunate race. Zealous missionaries felt they needed to save the Indian from paganism and savagery. And over time, this concept of guardianship became official colonial policy in the New World and was an accepted theory in international law by the late 19th century to justify colonization and the destruction of First Nations culture and worth. Our primate, Fred Hiltz, has established a special commission to bring awareness of the damage that the doctrine of discovery has done to the cultures of all people in this country of Canada. One thing I have learned is that for the Indigenous person, healing comes in their telling of their story many, many times. Our Anglo culture thinks that after you've told your story twice, then one should get on with living. But for the First Nations culture, telling the story over and over again brings healing and insight, affirmation and self-respect as they go deeper and deeper into their journey of understanding. But I need to warn you that for Anglicans and others, listening is not easy. We hear our way of life criticized. Truth hurts. Our forebears and church missionaries thought they were acting in an honorable way, and many of them were. But we need to remember that we have often betrayed our Indigenous brothers and sisters in treaties, diminished their culture, and left a deep level of distrust. Sadly, the damage goes through generations. We also have to face the pain of recognizing that there are strident voices in our dominant white culture who grumble that any attempts to work with First Nations will just be a waste of time. Well, of course, there are flaws on all sides, native and non-native, but not all is hopeless. I enjoy my time among these fellow Anglicans, and you may have seen recently that a new First Nations diocese has been established in Northern Ontario under the leadership of Bishop Lydia Makamua, chosen by the elders of the communities there and recently installed as the first bishop, Indigenous bishop of an Anglican Indigenous diocese. And she's just great. I listen to the quiet wisdom of the elders as they plan their future. I participate in traditional ceremonies. I hear young adults ready to move beyond seeing themselves as victims. I listen to the entrepreneurs and the young professionals who are establishing successful businesses. I enjoy the company of friends and shared laughter. In the evening, as we gathered in that sacred circle at Pinawa, there were marvelous times of jamboree with throat singing, great old gospel hymns, country and western music. Indigenous Anglicans love to sing, and they certainly dance when they get together. I've often heard Bishop Mark MacDonald, who is our national Indigenous bishop, say that when the non-native people ask the First Peoples, "What can we do?" the answer every time is, "Walk with us. Walk with us." And so may we have the courage to walk together through challenging truths and healing reconciliation. Amen.